Welcome back to Taiwan versus the world. Today we will meet again with two guests who proved popular judging from the feedback you, our listeners, sent me. They will discuss with me the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump. And their insights are sure to surprise you. Then I recorded a conversation for you about another visitor to Xi Jinping. Remember when the KMT chairwoman visited Beijing? Well, there was one little detail everyone should remember about it. But before that, let's get started with our interview. Everybody had an opinion on the meeting between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, so why not adding ours and try to do better than what we have been reading around? And what better than talking to Hioe and Rath Wang for this? Brian and Rath, hello and welcome back.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Rath and Brian, before we start, a little feedback. You've been guests together before in this program, and it was very much appreciated. I received several feedbacks from listeners who were very enthusiastic about hearing you. In particular, somebody who said that you were the Blues Brothers of Taiwan versus the world, so I think you can take that as a compliment.
That's a great compliment. Yeah, I'll take that compliment.
So before you start singing the blues, let's see if we can discuss the news. As I said, the meeting between the Chinese leader and the American president has caused a lot of comments, and yet, as usual, it was very opaque. We didn't see so much. So let's see what are the facts that we can actually see, that we can actually identify through the fog. Rath, I believe you have written a column recently about it. Maybe you want to start by telling us what you have observed about this meeting.
Sure. Be happy to talk about this, and also to clarify, because we've had global commentaries, global media coming out from the U.S., Japan, Europe, all over, saying that Trump has sold out Taiwan and has capitulated to Xi Jinping's request on Taiwan, which, despite all these negative headlines in terms of what the meeting has achieved for the U.S., and when it comes to Taiwan, I think it's completely misleading to say that, Taiwan was one of the biggest losers here. I mean, it could have been much worse. What had happened was that Trump actually did, in terms of official policy, keep that intact. So he did not promise Xi Jinping that, the U.S. would cease to sell weapons or, articles of defense to Taiwan. And he also did not give in to Xi Jinping's two most pressing demands, or what Xi Jinping wanted to, get most out of this meeting, which were, to have the U.S. commit to be opposed to Taiwan independence, which Trump, in terms of, the whole relationship, we probably need an hour to talk about strategic ambiguity, is to be vague about, the U.S. in terms of its support of Taiwan, vague about what form that would come in. But this strategic ambiguity was always about not telling Beijing that, the U.S. will not support, Taiwan in terms of, Taiwan's requests, or in terms of, the sensitivities of what is currently happening between, the U.S., Taiwan, and China, especially, when it comes to sensitive terms such as independence, which the U.S. has always been, phrasing. U.S. presidents since, Carter cut off official ties with Taipei was to say that the U.S. does not actively support Taiwan independence, but at the same time, it does not use the word oppose, which Trump, during all these meetings, which we've had global headlines saying that Trump was convinced by Xi to say that the U.S. opposes Taiwan independence, which Trump did not say. He did not say that he opposes Taiwan independence. And the second demand from Xi was that the U.S. would stop or commit to stopping arms sales to Taiwan, which Trump also did not cave in. Trump said that he is going to make a decision very soon in terms of approving, the few months delay, but he, of course, did not say that he would, halt arms sales to Taiwan. So, in terms of, the overall outcome for Taiwan, you could say that Taiwan did hold ground. So that in itself was a win for Taiwan because if you look at, the dynamics, what she wanted out most of, Trump in terms of giving into, sales of agricultural products, buying planes from Boeing, with the Trump delegation, he did not get what he wanted most out of, which was the two demands in regards to Taiwan.
Thank you, Rath. Yeah, Brian, if you want to also input and say what you think.
Right, of course. Yeah. So it is actually a question because I think Trump did say there are some people in Taiwan that want independence and did openly state, for example, that Taiwan and the question of arms sales to Taiwan, if you go through that, they were still considering, and this is a bargaining chip. So it does illustrate that Trump has a very transactional approach to looking at the US-Taiwan relationship, shared commitment to values or Taiwan being a democracy. That doesn't necessarily matter in that sense. The meeting itself with Xi was more or less, I think, a non-event. There's not a lot that came out of that. There's not a concrete deal, etc. Marco Rubio did an interview in the middle of it to try to reassure. And the printout, as in the past, has differed between the US and China, in which the US readout just does not mention Taiwan. And on the other hand, China's readout claims that Taiwan was discussed between the two leaders. And it is actually quite interesting when you do see, for example, the footage of Donald Trump being asked repeatedly by international reporters about Taiwan, just declining to comment. And then later on in his interview with Fox News, then he does make these more controversial remarks that did lead to this kind of questioning as was Taiwan thrown under the bus. I think it's still very much a question because we just don't know what goes through Donald Trump's head, as often occurs. And he does have this way of echoing where he talked to last. And so I think actually we're going to have to be waiting until next week to see if he's still saying this about Taiwan. But with regards to strategic ambiguity, there has long been this discussion of do you try to support Taiwan through symbolic means? Do you do kind of low profile ways of supporting Taiwan that are more substantive but don't risk Chinese counterattack or countermeasures in any form? Or in the case of Donald Trump, is he actually strategically ambiguous or is he unstrategically ambiguous? Because he does change what he says very often. And so I think we are in a kind of confusing situation here.
I agree with what Brian said. He tends to quote whoever he talked to last. And, there's a lot of ambiguity in Trump's messaging himself. But what was very, very interesting, I thought, was about, the comment that he would meet with, the person running Taiwan, which was, of course, implying that he was willing to meet with Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te. So that is in itself an interesting development. Whether or not that will happen, I think, is still a big question mark. But the fact that he did mention this is something that I think, is in the books, or it could reveal that, the closeness of how, the U.S. and Taiwan administrations, communicate or either are in sync in some way. So if it wasn't Trump himself, we know that, the two administrations do frequently collaborate and coordinate in terms of, national security, in terms of, regional cooperation, so and so forth.
Gentlemen, I believe that we are all agreeing. Brian, you just vindicated me when you started your answer just by saying that it was a non-event, because that was my feeling too. When I saw what emanated from this meeting, I thought, well, nothing's changing here. And something that strikes me, I think, is the misunderstanding, like you said, Rath, in all these comments, like if there was some sort of big change because Trump does not support Taiwan's independence. And also, but the United States never supported Taiwan's independence. It's always been their policy to maintain the status quo and to never support independence. I even read a book recently in which there was an article about a chapter dedicated to Taiwan's United States relationship, written by Keiko Hirata of University of California, in which he says that the United States plays deterrence against both China and Taiwan, trying to deter China from invading Taiwan and to deter Taiwan from declaring independence. So at the end of the day, there is absolutely nothing new in the idea that Donald Trump does not support independence. What do you think?
If you look at the chain of events, it's standard protocol with almost any U.S. visit to China, or either, U.S. meeting with the Chinese leader, because, after the U.S. says something ambiguous about, independence, because as you said, the U.S. is not, an active supporter of Taiwan independence, and protocol that's been going on for decades or 40 years is that, after that is said, the Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the presidential office comes out and says that Taiwan is already an independent country, so there's no need to declare independence. I mean, whatever comes in terms of independence, which the world is often deceived because of, Chinese influence in terms of global media or its own disinformation campaigns, is that that Taiwan is already an independent country with the name Republic of China. You could dispute that the name is misleading, and the national borders is misleading, but see no farther than to North Korea and South Korea. No one disputes that both countries are sovereign. It's the same way. I mean, even if they claim whatever in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that one is subordinate to the other. And if you look at that protocol, it's been always that the U.S. says something that you could see in nuance that the U.S. supports the status quo, and the status quo is that Taiwan remains de facto independent, in practice, in all forms, practical forms, independent. But to give China some face, there's some ambiguity there. And then Taiwan has the room to clarify that it's already independent. And if you look at that, it's a non-event because it's just like any other meeting with, U.S. leaders. You could argue that, the dynamics between how Trump and Xi were, or, how negative that was. But when it comes to Taiwan, I I think, overall it's still consistent.
I think that's the question here is that Trump did echo Xi's framing in some form, and I do question who he thinks is in charge of Taiwan. The KMT chair, Cheng Li-wun, for example, does plan to visit the US in June, as part of which she said that she hopes to meet with Donald Trump. And I think there is the danger that there may be some quarters of the Trump administration that are much more isolationist and do in fact want to scale back US commitments to Taiwan, which perhaps that could be a pretext saying that, well, now the KMT can handle cross-strait relations. It is quite interesting that regarding if there is an echoing of, for example, this notion of opposing Taiwanese independence, this was actually first brought up by Cheng Li-wun in her meeting with Xi Jinping not too long before the Trump-Xi meeting. And so indirectly then we see if Trump does echo Xi's language, that is in fact echoing Zhen's language. But then with regards to that, it is also the case that, of course, the US has not historically supported Taiwanese independence. I think what it was more a cause for direct concern is, for example, Trump going back on the six assurances, because that does state, for example, that the US will not consult with China on arms sales to Taiwan, as well as that then uh, Taiwan will continue to be provided with arms by the US. And Trump has stated numerous times that he is considering, and that's something he would discuss with Xi, which it should not be subject to. And so I think there is this concern about that.
So we identified here a genuine concern, which is the potentiality that Trump is starting to condition arms sales to whatever deal he is making with Xi Jinping. But still, I mean, how sure are we of this? Can you tell us more, please, about what has been discussed on this?
Yeah, I think it really ties into the contentious domestic politics, of course, about defense at present. And it is a rather kind of contradictory position. For example, the US has called on Taiwan to pass defense spending. And this is something that the KMT and TPP have really tried to block. And then finally, earlier this month, after basically weeks and weeks of being intractable on the issue, they do pass defense spending, but a pared down amount. And the US, for example, in terms of elected officials, tried to pressure the KMT to relent. And then Donald Trump unexpectedly tries to hold up further arms sales, or says he will, that he's discussing with Xi. And so he probably doesn't want to jeopardize his meeting by approving arms sales before that. But he also indicates now that he's still considering that. And the KMT's own narrative is right now that if there is a letter of acceptance from the US, then they'll be okay with more arms sales. And the DPP has indicated, for example, that they do intend to continue to pursue legal recourse regarding the fact that the defense spending was pared down and key programs, for example, regarding drone or anti-drone capacity, are not passed. And so I think that is that question of the defense spending, and I think that's particularly concerning when Trump is holding it up. It's not the first time this has happened, whether in Taiwan or elsewhere. For example, there was when reportedly Elbridge Colby, for example, in the Trump administration was holding up the arms shipments to Ukraine. And in this case, it does actually seem to be coming from up top, and that I think is something that Taiwan is probably watching very carefully.
There's also some concern in terms of arms sales from analysts saying that, Trump actually made some of these comments because of, the watered down version. Because, it could be that one possibility is that Trump isn't happy that, the KMT is holding off. But Trump, in that level, he would not know, either it was the DPP or the KMT that's holding it back. But they say that he was unhappy because, the watered down version is not what the full version that, the US government wanted to push through. And because of that, he is holding some sort of, verbal, ambiguity towards Taiwan because of that discontent. Because, whoever's in charge, because the president wouldn't understand domestic politics of Taiwan and why, the budget was watered down almost half. So because of not being able to pass that, Taiwan indirectly is taking a bit of the wrath of that. But if we were to get back the full amount, perhaps things would be moving quicker. Is also another argument that some analysts are saying. Of trying to understand what actually happened in terms of the ambiguity around Taiwan that we're seeing now.
But then Trump is only making it worse, isn't he? Because if he behaves this way, he is only reinforcing the American skepticism narrative by portraying the arms sales less as defense procurement and more as paying a bribe to him. So he is actually deteriorating the image of the United States in the eyes of the Taiwanese people, isn't he?
I think across the board, because of the messaging, a lot of traditionally MAGA politicians have come out to say that this could be, used as Chinese propaganda. But in terms of the substance, I think those in the administrations still, are holding firm on, Taiwan's support, and that is still there, even though you know, there's room for China to, to take advantage of, the messaging in terms of definitely not the best thing for soft power or, the U.S.'s image in Taiwan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this definitely gives a lot of ammunition to US skeptics in that sense. And ironically, then Trump has perhaps played into the KMT's hands. And I think that is not a great sign, particularly for the DPP, when the DPP has staked a lot of political capital on reassuring of the stability of US-Taiwan relations, that the US is a dependable ally in time, and trying to counter then the narratives that come out of China, but also increasing the pan-blue camp of how, for example, the US foment's conflict and getting closer to the US can lead to Taiwan having the fate of Ukraine, similar to how Ukraine got too close to NATO, therefore provoking Russian aggression, which is somehow framed as defensive in nature. And in this sense, I don't think the US skeptic views are going to go away anytime soon. I think what's interesting is you do see actually the Lai administration, yeah, emphasizing Taiwan's sovereignty, but also bringing up Republic of China in a way that did not always come up in the past, because there's this need then, I think, to say to Trump that, well, we're not pursuing independence either, but also we're not going to be, as Lai put it, sacrificed or traded away on this kind of game of global geopolitics. I think particularly if Cheng Li-wun as KMT chair is smart, she will just try to really leverage on this. And she's, of course, already been very willing to go to China and try to craft messaging in coordination with China. And I think then this does actually give, ways for them to exploit this kind of opportunity it presents in terms of influencing the political discourse in Taiwan, particularly regarding the advisability of US-Taiwan relations.
Thank you, gentlemen. And now let's look at the other side. It was just one day in the meeting when state media immediately made it public that Xi was giving a warning to Trump to be careful about Taiwan. And immediately, of course, the global media immediately unleashed on this about like a stark warning, like it was like if it was central to the conversation. Now this is something that we saw on state media, and for us people who are always working on Taiwan, well, this is pretty much standard state media, isn't it? Somebody asked me what I thought about it, and I say, well, you know, this is Chinese state media. They would cram up the importance of the Taiwan issue in the middle of a communique about the production of toilet paper. They can't shut up about it. They always come back with that narrative, whatever happens. We don't need to take it as face value. So tell me, do you agree with the feeling I'm expressing here? Like, what is your reaction to Chinese state media trying to push forth the Taiwan question?
In terms of Chinese state media, I don't think we've seen anything new. I think they're trying to hype up the Taiwan issue, and if you look at you know how the U.S. responded, it was more of just ignoring all that rhetoric. Although as both have already mentioned, I think there's a great deal that they can leverage in terms of some of the words that came out from Trump.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, to follow up on that, then I think it's true. I think state media will lean into the usual claims. It is, of course, in the interest of the Chinese state to sow doubt about the U.S., not only as a means of soft power, but because Taiwan may be more willing to acquiesce to China if there's a belief that the U.S. will not intervene or may make things worse. And I think in that sense, particularly because Trump is so transactional, that does feed into this claim that is often then circulated by the KMT and by China that, for example, these weapons are useless. They're just trying to make money off of you. They're going to hollow out your semiconductor industry. Uh, so I think it's that, and I think that particularly the Trump administration. I mean, it's true that diplomacy is always transactional in that sense, but then there's no hiding it with Trump, and particularly when someone like Marco Rubio, who is a more traditional diplomat, is trying to smooth things over. I think the inability to show shows actually when it occurs at the highest level. That being said, I think with the last two presidents of the U.S., whether Biden or Trump, there's a lot of statements that are made and walked back, and both are rather old, of course. And so I think particularly if there's this view that, well, maybe this doesn't need to be taken that seriously, it will not necessarily have that impact. So I think again, like I said, I think it is to be seen if there's a much more sustained shift in discourse on Trump's part, and maybe it's just too early to see. But in the coming weeks, we'll see what statements he makes following up on that then.
And I also just wanted to add one thing that, from state media is that, it's the first time I think that they rebroadcasted, the 9,500-mile comment of Trump from Fox News, which, Fox actually was banned in China, and Chinese state media has repeatedly condemned it. But, they use this as a propaganda, right from, the mouth of the US president, which I think, would be misconstrued in many ways in terms that the US would be leaving Taiwan on its own.
So yes, like you both said, and Brian insisted on this, that it may be also too early to see what the long-term effect will be. So you would notice that in this program, we tend to already take maybe a couple of weeks before we comment on facts to see what happens, to be less into the heat of the moment. But still, it may not even be long enough already. But do we see already some effects beyond just the media noise? Is there any change that we are already observing or not?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think that in terms of the state media narrative, it's not really new. I think China has basically the same playbook. And I think sometimes in the past few months, when one looks at China's playbook, it just tends to be sort of the same. For example, after the Xi meeting, just more incentives were announced targeting Taiwan, and that always happens in that sense. With regards to the meeting itself, actually, it was interesting to note that Chinese military threats to Taiwan increased during that time. And then afterwards, for example, though Zhen called for Taiwan's inclusion in the World Health Organization as an observer, that didn't occur. The Chinese pressure continued. And so I think in that sense, there has not been a lot of originality on the Chinese side. And then when it comes to the narratives that come out of it, it's just taking whatever opportunities present themselves regarding Trump, making misstatements. And that's been consistent, again, as I mentioned, with either Biden or Trump, whenever they make something that causes Taiwan to feel insecure, then state media will exploit it for all it's worth. And so I think that's not so new in that sense.
I agree with Brian in terms of, the Chinese state media. And one thing that I thought was interesting was not the response from the Chinese side, but how, countries neighboring China that are also neighbors of Taiwan are responding. If you see, the response from Japan, Japan recently, just of last week, and they've been coordinating to put more, missile defense systems right off the coast of Taiwan. So, their most southernmost islands, which would be a direct response to any Chinese attack on Taiwan. And you just saw a few days ago, the Filipino president, Marcos Jr., Bongbong came out to say that, if there was an attack on Taiwan, it would definitely impact the Philippines. And the Philippines are, discussing what they would do in terms of that response. I mean, you haven't seen such coordinated or reactionary responses come that quick. So it shows that, even if the spoke is gone, but the hub is gone, but the spokes are working together to support, another partner, which is of Taiwan, because, both in terms of shared values, you could argue that, but or in terms of, the economic impact, Japan and the Philippines being, the closest neighbors of Taiwan would be very much directly impacted in terms of not just, exports, in terms of, trade, energy, you name it.
So, Rath, you are mentioning something very interesting here indeed, is that the Philippines president pretty much like did a Takaichi somehow. He kind of made the attitude of, Sonai Takaichi by saying pretty much the same, that an attack on China would cause the Philippines to move forward. So, yeah, thank you, Rath, for mentioning this. Brian, maybe would you like to comment also on this? Do you have something to say about this?
Right, yeah. I mean, I think that's very well put. He did do a Takeichi in that sense. It's also interesting because of the fact that there are some countries in the region that view a Taiwan conflict as not implicating them. For example, South Korea has sometimes taken that view. But then we also see these interesting shifts. For example, South Korea and Japan bearing the hatchet when there historically has been a great deal of enmity. And that's something that, again, took place under Takeichi's leadership in that sense. And when it comes to Marcos, it's not the first time this kind of signaling has come up. For example, he did tweet in support of, not in support, and congratulating Lai Ching-te on his election victory. And that was seen as a sign of closer ties. In terms of Filipino domestic politics as well, Marcos is the one that is in favor of maintaining the traditional military alliance with the US. Whereas, for example, Duterte, his political rival, who is now in jail, it was more in favor of rebalancing towards China. And so that is also figures into Filipino domestic politics. But I think particularly with the clashes in the South China Seas regarding especially the impact on fishermen, and then regarding disputed territory like the Scarborough Shore, I think the Philippines is actually much more cautious. And he did bring up, for example, the many migrant workers, the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Filipino migrant workers in Taiwan. But I think there's also the aspect of just geopolitical security because yeah, the Philippines is next door. It's a maritime power that is increasingly coming into tension with China. And if there were a impact from the Taiwan contingency, that would affect maritime shipping and travel in the region. That would definitely implicate the Philippines. Merely acknowledging that sometimes has caused China to react very strongly, as we saw with Takaichi, with the diplomat threatening to decapitate her, for example. With regards to the Philippines, we haven't seen as much of a strong reaction. But I think this rhetoric is then interesting from Marcus's part.
Yeah, I think in terms of Philippines, that there's been, as Brian mentioned, Marcos has, been warming up ties with Taiwan, and we've seen more Channel 2 delegations between, the different ministries, from defense to, economics, agricultural, and all that, and I think he's much more willing to speak up when in terms of. And there was a spat, I think, a few months ago when, the Philippine Coast Guard spokesperson was attacked and asked by, I think, the Chinese side to remove him, or either, to even the Chinese ambassador was reprimanded by Marcos for requesting that. And Jay Terriella. So, yeah, so he's been very vocal about, Chinese violations and what China has been doing in terms of influence operations in the Philippines, and a close friend of Taiwan. Jay has been to Taiwan, I think, many times, and I think he recently met with President Lai. So we know that there's coordination between the two. But I also wanted to add in terms of Japan, because as you both mentioned, Takaichi, and she's been very supportive of in terms of beefing Japan's defense capabilities. Lots of systems have been moved to Yonaguni, Okinawa, the areas most close to Taiwan. And there's been a lot of speculation in Japanese media that, in her phone call with Trump after his China trip, one of the main issues that were talked about was actually Taiwan. So, she's, if you call her Abe version or, two, she has been an advocate for Taiwan and still continues to be one, and despite perhaps, her her diplomacy, she different personality to Abe. She's been consistent on Taiwan with him, and what's interesting is the Japanese public is also supportive of this. From poll to poll, in terms of increasing support in regards to Taiwan, it's always been over 50%, and her popularity still lies, I think was it in the mid 60s or something as of last week. So, she has the public support to continue to push on her security agenda, despite, most of Japan's population being against, some of her a bit dated conservative views in terms of gender diversity and all the other aspects that I think has been more progressive that we've seen in the world. To add on Japan, I think in the past 5 years, Brian probably has heard a lot as well that equally important to the U.S. in terms of Taiwan security is actually Japan, because despite Japan acting like it's keeping a low profile, it has actually one of the largest militaries in the world, though called the Self-Defense Forces, and it's the by far the closest, most powerful force next to Taiwan. So even some analysts in Washington argue that the Japanese force is actually more important than the U.S. force because in terms of capability, it matches that of the U.S. A lot of its technology comes from the U.S. and its its proximity is right next door, which, is if Taiwan needs aid, it can be there right away.
Thank you very much, Rath, for these insights on the two countries. And now to finish, well, personally, I've never been called the Blues Brothers, not even Cap Calloway. But somebody told me that they really like this program and say it's one of the best on Taiwan. And my reaction was, well, that's not exactly a challenge, isn't it? The coverage on Taiwan is quite mediocre in global media. We just touched on that. The coverage on what this meeting made for Taiwan was quite like borders on disinformative sometimes. So the question is why? Why people who are professional, I mean, they're supposed to know better than the three of us. So why don't they say this? What exactly is blocking the emergence of a correct narrative in global media? What are your thoughts on this?
I think if you put it in one word, it's China, because it's either the fear of China or self-censorship, and and it comes back to China in terms of not wanting to cause headlines that would oppose business, because China has different ways of infiltration or influence. So because of that, there's a lot of self-censorship in global media, and also in terms of you know not having a focus on Taiwan because of China's market. So you would get news perspectives from correspondents based in Beijing as opposed to correspondents based in Taipei. So it's out of fear and out of lack of interest.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think there's often this pretense towards objectivity in the media that actually then platforms China's view in that sense. And I think then it's just oftentimes it'll be the repeating of Chinese talking points as though this were fact or needed to be part of a news report because this is being fair and balanced. And yet is just not true in that sense. I think that often the refusal of journalists to make more analytic points actually also just leaves a lot of this opaque, or that there's a lack of kind of historical knowledge that is brought in when you do have, for example, Trump and Xi meeting and making these statements. I think that's a major issue with journalism today.
And I think, just to add, there's also the aspect on how China can leverage a large sector of the so-called liberal world, or the more progressive world, because I think in many eyes, not all liberals, I usually consider myself liberal leaning, so is that the largest aggressor in the world is actually the US. So when it comes to China, they usually give China an easier time because China is an emerging power. But I think oftentimes liberal-leaning analysts fail to see that China's also doing a lot of, the dirty work that, say the US and former, say, Western colonial powers have done. But if you look in reality, you know, I, I'm not going to apologize for the West or the US because, it's obviously we've seen that in history what has happened. But what China is currently doing is equally as bad or even worse. So if we talk about the present, um, there tends to be a tendency to look over that and to praise China for bringing millions of people out of poverty. But where in actuality, China is also doing the same thing in terms of what the West did in the past few centuries in terms of colonizing other peoples, trying to invade, take land, to control Taiwan, take over Taiwan, control the Asia Pacific, and to replace the US as a new hegemon.
Thank you, Rath.
Right.
This is, as I always say, China loves European colonialism. It just doesn't like that it was done by Europeans instead of China. Brian and Rath, thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for your insights, and hope to talk to you again soon.
You. Take care.
Thank you.
2 weeks ago, I published a column in a Taiwanese newspaper in reaction to the visit of Kuomintang chairwoman Cheng Li-wun to China and her meeting with Xi Jinping. My column took aim at the way she was wrongly portrayed in much of the foreign media reporting on her trip. I noted that she was often called the leader of the opposition in Taiwan. However, this is not accurate. There is no such formal title in Taiwan, and being the head of one of the opposition parties does not give her the kind of power and influence that a leader of the opposition would have in other democracies. This led me to have an interesting conversation on the topic with another person who publicly comments on Taiwanese politics.
Hi, my name is Sean King, and I'm a senior vice president at Park Strategies, which is a business advisory firm in New York. Well, as far as I see it, as head of the KMT, Cheng Li-wun went to the mainland as other KMT leaders have done. And, there's nothing wrong with all parties and all sides talking. It's just unfortunate, and it's the U.S. view that Beijing should also be talking to Taiwan's duly elected government and not just figures in various parties whom they may find convenient to engage. So, it's productive probably that she went, but I think Beijing should also be talking to Taiwan's government itself.
Before we go further into what her role is, you just said that it can be, so pretty much you say it can be useful that a KMT politician speaks to China. Can you
Sure.
tell us what? Can you tell us
yeah.
why? Can you tell us what's good about it? What could be good about it?
I think because it could cause Beijing to realize the KMT's own electoral challenges. And, because leaders in Beijing have not dealt with democracy themselves, they may not know the true challenges of democracy until they deal with somebody who has had to contend in that arena. So as Cheng Li-wun explains to Xi Jinping and others how big her challengers is at home, because her views on cross-strait relations are really out of the Taiwan mainstream in many ways. Maybe Beijing will wake up and get a better sense of reality on Taiwan, and maybe it creates a precedent for them to talk to other forces in Taiwan, and hopefully maybe one day Taiwan's duly elected government. But so long as that's the DPP, I sadly don't see that happening.
Now, you said that you said that her views are very marginal in Taiwan. Is that including within the KMT?
Well, I don't follow the KMT that closely, although I do know that there is a much more pro-American faction within the KMT, of which she's not part. But when she says she wants people on Taiwan to be proud to say they're Chinese, most surveys I see, less than 5% of people on Taiwan identify as purely Chinese. And also another unfortunate thing that caught my ear when she went over there was how much bashing she did of Japan. And as much as people on Taiwan like America, with or without Trump, they like Japan even more. So not only her views on Taiwan's Chinese history and identity are not in touch with most people on Taiwan, but also her anti-Japan views don't really match what most people in Taiwan feel today.
And then is the question of how to qualify her. So you and I agreed on this. A lot of people refer to her as leader of the opposition. I argue that she is not, personally. And I noted that at some point you referred to her simply as KMT chairwoman, which she is. How do you see the difference between these two?
Yeah, on a recent Singapore broadcast, I guess out of just muscle memory, I did initially refer to her as an opposition leader, but I later focused on her as KMT chairwoman because this is a KMT to CCP get together, like so many things. The KMT and Chinese Communist Party started out as allies 100 years ago, then they became bitter enemies, and now they use each other for pragmatic purposes on cross-strait issues when it suits them. But opposition leader, as I look back, was probably not the best term to use because she's no longer a member of the legislative yuan. She has no elected position. It's not like in the US, it would be, say, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate or Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries in the US House of Representatives. She has no legislative or government power and hasn't been elected to anything outside her party. So, and the opposition itself within Taiwan, at least its majority in the LY, is now a KMT TPP coalition. So, I think it's important that we refer to her as a KMT chairwoman and not as an opposition leader, even though I myself have made the mistake of saying that.
Yes, I agree with you. I argue that it's exaggerating to call her leader of the opposition because this is confusing for foreign audiences. Because leader in the opposition, for example, in parliamentary democracies, is even much cleaner than the United States. Like the leader of the opposition is pretty much like the person who would automatically become prime minister the majority changed. But here, we're not even sure that Cheng Li-wun would be the next presidential candidate for the KMT.
Yes, I think your way is the way to go. And at least I was right toward the end of my TV interview. And going forward, I will refer to her only as the chairperson. Because if you're right, if you say you're leader of the Tories in Britain, if Starmer falls and calls a snap election and Labour loses, that person is prime minister. So you're right. She really should be considered the chairwoman of the party because this is a cross-strait party thing. Because Beijing never wants to give the Republic of China government any credibility. So they would never want to refer to her governmental or opposition leader role anyway, because then they have to admit that there's a separate democracy on Taiwan. So this is a party-to-party business and nothing to do with legislature or presidential. I also was disappointed that when Premier Zhou went to Japan for the World Baseball Classic game against Czechia, now, obviously, he chose that game because he was all but certain that Taiwan was going to win, which they did. I mean, if he went to see South Korea or Japan, they might lose. But I thought that was a great triumph for President Lai's government that the first time since derecognition in 1972, a sitting premier is in Japan. Now, whether it was personal, privately funded, private trip, whatever, it was still a great victory for the ROC government for Taiwan. I was disappointed and surprised to see the KMT try to critique that on the edges and poo-poo it. They should be celebrating that. Similarly, when President Lai made, let's say, lemonade out of lemons last week and ended up getting to Eswatini anyway, I was, on the other hand, very happy to see the KMT praise the visit. So good and bad, but want to see all parties work for the betterment of Taiwan and obviously for U.S.-Taiwan relations. So I'll be keeping a close eye on Cheng Li-wun's visit when she comes to the U.S. sometime soon.
We will meet again next week for a new episode of Taiwan versus the World.